Welcome to our audience here in McLean and to our virtual audience online. I'm Leanne Howard, Senior Principal for National Security. I joined MITRE about 4 months ago after over 20 years with the Defense Department, predominantly working overseas with allies and partners as a strategist and planner. So this topic is near and dear to my heart. MITRE is a fantastic organization. It is often at the heart of innovative solutions for government, supporting departments and agencies on a myriad of projects, prototypes, and architectures, some well-known, such as JWICS or the attack framework, and others quietly keeping us safe. Today, we are here for an important event on great power rivalry. This event is part of the Strategic Competition Series and is co-hosted by MITRE's National Security Sector. This speaker series is in its 5th year. We highlight issues related to policy and strategic competition, creating a chapeau of perspectives that informs our scientific work and research. We've heard from experts on a range of topics, including economic statecraft, supply chain, space, demographics, and many others. Rear Admiral retired Mike Studeman and Matt Sollenberger join us today for this discussion on strategic rivalry between the West, China, and Russia, and Chris Bassler will further introduce our panelists as our moderator. This is a big topic, and we know that competition is evolving and expanding. We also recognize a web of interdependencies that must be considered in these relationships. Strategy is active, and it is responsive. And while the core of our objectives remain firm, how we approach our goals to gain advantage is dynamic. It's systemic, and our nation requires capabilities and tools to underwrite our strategy and enable success. So as we discuss geostrategic rivalries that shape our future, I'd also like to plant the seeds of areas where we are investing our research and engineering in direct support of these departments and agencies and enabling U.S. alliances, simultaneously as a deterrent to our adversaries and to ensure our competitive advantage. First, we must enhance our integration of autonomous and hybrid systems to strengthen defense capabilities. Next, harmonizing economic statecraft with defense strategy, looking domestically and globally, is crucial for a unified security approach. Third, modernizing nuclear capabilities and streamlining acquisition processes will ensure preparedness, while prioritizing industrial production and innovation in munitions, and that will build resilience. Fourth, investing in joint command and control will enable operational speed and scale. Fifth, and interwoven, developing next-generation strategic cyber approaches and understanding their integrated impacts are vital. Lastly, we must explore orbital warfare concepts and establish a space theory of victory with allies and commercial partners. With that, I look forward to the discussion on Russia and China with our esteemed colleagues. For there's much to talk about in the frame of strategic rivalry that will shape our collective security and inform our strategy, our research, our policies, and our investments. So on that light note, just a few points before we begin. First, we'll leave about 15 minutes at the end of the hour for questions. For the online audience, please use the Q&A function to submit your questions at any time during this presentation. For the in-person audience, raise your hand and we'll come around with a microphone. Also, for everyone here in the room, please take a moment to mute your phones and devices. Thank you so much for joining us today. Now, please allow me to turn it over to Chris to get the program going.
Well, thanks, Leanne, and good morning, everyone. Great to be here, and happy Friday. We are very fortunate enough today to have very esteemed colleagues, both Mike Studeman and Matt Sollenberger, joining us for this very important discussion. As Leanne mentioned, all these different technical areas, system engineering, technical capability development that MITRE does, Russia and China in particular, both each themselves, and then, of course, the recent collaborations between them together are really at the forefront of a lot of the work we do and are going to really be the crux of our conversation today. So we're very fortunate enough to have two great colleagues. They both have very long, distinguished careers, so I will give them very short introductions. Many are very familiar to you, of course. First, Mike Studeman, who's former commander of the Office of Naval Intelligence and is one of MITRE's first National Security Fellows. He has a long, distinguished career, retired as a two-star from the Navy, worked on the front lines of Indo-PACOM, of Southcom, of Cyber Command, not just against China and Russia, but also Iran and North Korea. So really across the world, across the adversaries. At the same time, Matt Sollenberger also, over the last 20 years, worked a number of different government positions across the intelligence community and other places. But his most notable assignment before coming to MITRE was working on the National Intelligence Council, and of course the quiet period in February of 2022, and since with not a lot going on, obviously since then, especially on the Russia side. So we're very fortunate to have Mike and Matt. Welcome. So I really want to get started first today with a little bit of context setting. So there's lots of issues we will dive into very specifically, but kind of in this geostrategic environment, in the changes for 2025, now in the second month of the new calendar year. Mike, why don't you get us started with kind of understanding the situation of where we're at?
I do think, thanks Chris, I do think that the strategic environment needs to be described before we start going prescriptive on how we're going to deal with any individual problem, no matter how large. And the way that I personally think through some of these macro trends in the geopolitical environment, I break it down into my 5 Ds, and I take a look at destabilization, deglobalization, depopulation, disinformation, and disintegration. These are all kind of related to one another, but in terms of deglobalization, I don't think anybody argues that we've gone beyond slowbalization, which was a term that somebody used in political science to describe things that were looking shaky for a globalized world. And now we're clearly past peak globalization, where the idea of cheap goods no longer is sufficient to compensate for the risks to jobs, to certain companies and national interests, and so the rise of protectionism is upon us. We've seen that in histories before, and it is significant. The destabilization, everybody doesn't need to be educated on what's happening in the Middle East or in Europe or even in the Western Pacific, but look, you can go to any continent and take a look at the Pan-Sahel region from Mali to Burkina Faso and Niger and Sudan, to say that everywhere around you, you find an unmooring, which is generating ripple effects throughout the global community. People focus on migration, but it's not just that. And so destabilization, deglobalization, those are important. And then depopulation, there's a longer arc to this, but essentially the numbers that suggest that we increase overall on the planet are hiding the fact that that's mainly growth in sub-Saharan Africa, which is probably an issue unto itself with regard to the ability of governance to take care of those people. But the rest of the modern world is facing fertility rates that are, either even or declining, which means something with regard to stresses on economies, how to take care of aging populations, and all the rest. I would go through disinformation and say, what more do you need to know than to read your phones on any given morning to recognize how misled people can be with regard to things that just aren't true. And it has consequences in the micro and the macro scale. And look, if in our case a democracy doesn't have clean information to run on, it will choke. That engine will choke up, and I think we're already seeing evidence of this. And then finally, with disintegration, I think that the trend is to see how we're going into loose blocks of countries. I'd ask Matt to comment here in a second, but whereas those blocks could be tighter, they may be growing tighter in some cases. I think what you're finding is a loose blue block, a loose red block, and then the global south, maybe with more agency to hedge between them, where distrust is growing for the major leaders of the blue and the red block. So those are some of the 5 Ds that I use to think about the future, but I'd invite Matt to comment on anything with regard to context.
Yeah, I think the last one you mentioned is the one to me that jumps out as really being critically important when you're talking about the sort of the U.S. approach to strategic competition, to maintaining our advantage. I think actually Secretary Rubio mentioned something to this effect in the past week, talking about how we are shifting from, or have shifted from, right, an environment where the U.S. enjoyed many advantages as kind of a unipolar power. And the Secretary talked about as a return to a multipolar world. It could be more accurate, perhaps, to talk about it in a bipolar world. But I think nested within that is an added challenge. If you go back to, let's say, the Cold War, you had very, very clear leaders, very, very cleanly defined blocks. I think right now you have in this sort of red block that you mentioned there, Mike, maybe a competition perhaps brewing, between who will be seen as the sort of the primary agent there, whether it's China, whether it's Russia. Maybe it's not clear that others who would fall into that block, your Irans, your DPRKs, other states, would see themselves even following that lead, even if taking a step back, we can say, okay, look, by your actions, by your opposition to sort of like the U.S.-led global system, clearly you're in that camp.
This weakening overall, if I can just comment, I think is unmooring sort of the stability of the entire international system as these main actors on the stage are vying for power in their own spheres of influence. They all have distinct goals there, but when they're loosely aligned and where they see opportunity, they are moving out on their marks and to be able to change what they see as something that does them a disservice. Putin talked about new rules or no rules, right? And so that's the kind of adversarial-like environment that we have where fragmentation is the order of the day.
So Matt, within these kind of, the bigger context that both of you talked about, let's kind of narrow in at the friction point, of kind of these spheres of influence and kind of the most dangerous and contentious kind of front lines for this. So, tell us a little bit about kind of your view about what's really the arc of the war in Ukraine for this year before we then think about broader trajectories for China and Russia also within 2025.
Sure. And I think, first I should caveat that, within this broader arc, this year perhaps is among the more promising since the war began to potentially envision some sort of settlement or off-ramp, but I'll hold that thought. I don't definitely come back to what escaped the question that you asked. I think the arc of the war is probably a bit of an unfortunate one, at least as it goes for Ukraine. I mean, if you look back over the past year, you saw this conflict defined by this grinding and attritional and very World War II-like or Korea-like, but just a throwback to state-on-state warfare that we really haven't had to confront so acutely in the West for quite some time. Amidst all of that, you saw Ukrainian forces absolutely innovating, right? You've seen very impressive use and generation of unmanned systems. I believe they're being helped by more than a few in that arena. But despite that, they are and have been falling back. I think last year they lost something like 4,100 square kilometers, so call it maybe 2/3 the size of the state of Delaware. You're seeing some increasing signs from Ukrainian troops themselves when they're talking about dire shortages of trained, capable infantry, challenges with morale, issues that are frankly hard to rectify. And on the Russian side, right, they're certainly paying a horrible price. I think the UK recently released a public estimate, pegging Russian casualties to date in excess of 700,000. They're likewise paying a very heavy toll in equipment, armored vehicles, and the like. But it seems like the Russians are postured to be able to sustain this grueling and attritional battle and continue to inch forward. And I think the longer that you iterate that kind of dynamic, the greater the risk that Ukrainian losses might accelerate.
So, Mike, as the Chinese look at this and they look at the activities in Ukraine, they look at Russia's experience in Ukraine, they have their own agenda and their own, Xi Jinping has his own focus. What do you kind of see as China's plans and trajectory in your assessment for 2025?
Yeah, I think the Chinese have done a lot of learning, like everybody else has, about the nature, character of war and what it takes to actually fight in the modern age. And so they're making sure they incorporate all of those lessons at the tactical and operational level. People sometimes just kind of boil it down to drones, but it's more than that. But the way that you adapt, the way that you use electronic warfare, the space elements of it, cyber information, there are lessons in the way you use nuclear saber rattling. Those kinds of things have been taken seriously by the Chinese, and they're looking for how they would then adopt those or adapt them for things in their near abroad. I think on the macro level, it's very clear that China took a look at the sanctions playbook that we threw against Russia and said, how do I, if and when I go against any one of my territorial ambitions, how do I make sure that my economy is going to be less vulnerable to that? And so after 22, and you had seen shades of securitization of the economy before that, seeking self-reliance and moving out in the technology world to ensure that they had integrity of their information technology and all the rest. But this was really supercharged when the Chinese took a look and said, okay, I need to be able to take on an entire Western sanctions regime, and therefore, what do I need to do in order to blunt any of those effects? And so that's the reason why Xi Jinping has taken hard choices that have had sharp economic impacts to the Chinese economy, but it's security uber alles. As much as they'd love to have the economy stabilize and find its way out of the hole it's in today, they won't prioritize the economy over security given the geopolitical environment today. And finally, I just say that the ultimate outcome of the Ukraine war will deliver the ultimate lesson to the Chinese. If in fact the Russians were able to retain eastern Ukraine and endure and still survive everything the world threw at it and comes out in a few years, sort of bounce back into a normal status, then China will take a look and say, well, listen, I think I'm better equipped militarily. I think I can do things faster. I've learned those lessons. I may be able to accomplish some sovereignty goals here and endure this if, in fact, that the outcome is that I recover lost territory too.
So it'd be worth a shot.
Right. So we had hoped that it would be a complete failure for Putin and Russia here. A settlement is probably the only approach that seems reasonable for all parties. At the end of the day, you may have a negative lesson that the Chinese could take away from it.
So Matt, picking up on that, what should we expect from Russia this year, and especially in the context of if there's a settlement or the kind of contours of a settlement that you could envision? How do you envision Russia then for 2025?
Yeah, I will get to that, Chris, but I want to respond to something that Mike just said here, which I think is interesting and important, not least because what I'm going to talk about on settlement might envision leaving some Ukrainian territory, if unacknowledged, in Russian hands. I think it's very important to consider how we frame and characterize, accurately so, right, the strategic debacle that Russia walk itself into in this war. Even if they emerge with additional portions of Ukrainian territory under their control on the back end of a settlement, we've seen the expansion of NATO in ways that were really not envisioned as plausible if you go back even just a couple years ago. We've seen Europe take fairly significant measures to kind of wean itself off of the insidious drug that is cheap Russian energy. We've seen the Russians pay a very high price in other areas for their fixation with and their investment in Ukraine, right? To probably walk up some of their inability to backstop the Assad regime, which had been a key enabler of Russian power in the Middle East because they were fixated on Ukraine. So I think you can talk about a settlement in which, sure, Putin is going to spin it as a win. I think he somehow managed to spin losing the better part of 1 million Russians as a win, but one which the West can rightly characterize as a strategic victory, although not a total victory for Ukraine, U.S., and our other allies and partners.
I think that's exactly right. And so the long-term impacts are severe on Russia. These big countries, so we call them the red bloc countries, are typically very adept at the information manipulation. So they will cast all these things as a win, or the costs weren't as high, they didn't suffer as much. If they kind of believe their own rhetoric, that becomes very dangerous. But it puts a premium on how we talk informationally about the consequences and what this wrought in the world. And to the extent that we're demure and we don't address this in our information instruments, I think that perhaps that'll be spun away from us in a way that that wasn't so bad or wasn't so hard, and could invite, some future aggression if we're not careful. So we need to remind the world and them of exactly what the consequences have been.
So, wholeheartedly agree, and following up my promise to not dodge the question. I think pretty much everyone agrees that there are three primary stumbling blocks that you have to address in any sort of settlement, right? There's territorial resolution, there's Ukraine's alignment status, and then distinct from, related to the second pillar would probably be the size of their post-conflict military. On the first, when it comes to territory, you can go back as far as the early months of the war, and there's been great press coverage of these sidebar negotiations between the Russians and the Ukrainians at the time, in which the Ukrainians, as part of an overarching peace deal, were willing to contemplate Russia regaining, or rather, wrong word there, Russia maintaining control of, albeit maybe not recognized control of, areas sort of behind the line of contact. So I think building on that, as well as I think the National Security Advisor the other week mentioned that all parties need to accept some measure of the sort of reality on the ground where the battle lines are, because it's hard to envision the Ukrainians pushing the Russians out of every inch of Ukraine. So I think there's an area where some sort of status quo might be accepted, if not recognized. That would definitely be a concession of sorts. On the flip side, you want to make sure that Ukraine, has both the capabilities and the guarantees necessary to prevent a country that, in the past 12 years has been invaded twice by Russia from having to endure some sort of hat trick. So clearly, any effort to just neuter Ukraine's military forces, that's something where I think the West could and should push back on, ensure they have the capability to defend themselves. And as much as that will be a difficult pill for the Kremlin to swallow, if the offer there, let's say, is accompanied by some acknowledgement or codification that Ukraine is probably unlikely going to get into NATO anytime in the near future, which is not a revolutionary thing to say. This sort of only recently entered the dialogue, and there are other ways to ensure Ukraine has the security guarantees necessary to ward off, hopefully just deter future acts of aggression. In my mind, those broad strokes would probably encapsulate some sort of settlement. The details would be pernicious, but then again, they always are.
I think there's one additional thing on the nuclear front, too. People don't want to talk about nuclear issues, but you better be having a conversation because they're back in play in almost any major scenario, and they've already been used in a way that have shaped behaviors, including how much arms we were prepared to give to Ukraine. And I think the Ukrainians learned the lesson that they gave up their nukes, right? They became independent. That was the deal, and they were attacked, right? And so I think some countries are questioning this route where we had locked in sort of this non-proliferation regime. It was fairly stable. These discussions about, South Korea and Japan, whether or not they can believe in American extended deterrence, depending on how much confidence they have in Washington. But the very idea that your neighbor may have nukes and you may not, and this is an existential question, may continue to generate conversations which are occurring with regard to whether or not other nations need to actually have a different kind of nuclear capability to deter.
At least recontemplating those possibilities. So even despite the kind of, the nuclear dynamics and that consideration, another, key thing, of course, which we've observed in Ukraine, especially by the Russians, is kind of this return to countervalue targeting of critical infrastructure, even with conventional weapons. And so when we think about other plausible kind of alternatives and approaches and so on, how do you guys see those dynamics? Is that a tool that'll continue to be more used in the toolbox and should be something that should be
readily prepared for? Was that kind of an anomaly that we saw just in Ukraine? How do you guys think about that dynamic?
Let me start on China maybe, because I think people are well schooled here and online with regard to our vulnerabilities in our critical infrastructure. So clearly, call this conventional, but the Chinese have a suite of tools, options to use against us, so that it goes well beyond sort of the military realm. They're designed to affect the mindset and the willpower of our nation to actually continue to contest perhaps a Chinese move somewhere in the Western Pacific. And look, we're working on this. We're trying to harden ourselves. We have a lot of legacy systems that are very expensive to replace. But if we don't figure this out, we'll find that there's an asymmetry of countervalue advantage that our big adversaries will not hesitate to use because they know the impact on our society, and they will do the plausible denial route there. They'll claim it's not them. And in the meantime, we'll find that we didn't comprehensively look at what it would take to prepare our society for a bad day. These are conversations that are not occurring as widely as they should in our national dialogue. To say we have a different world, we have stronger adversaries working more closely together. There are scenarios where this could develop, and the homeland is not safe, right? And so if you're looking at Chinese non-nuclear EMP, electromagnetic pulse, and how they might be tempted to use those, which have nuclear-like effects too. I mean, there's a set of options here that the Chinese have, from space, cyber, all the way through other conventional weapons, that they're building inside of their armory to be able to use against us depending on the circumstances.
So maybe in the past years where there was some, at least in U.S. national security circles, some rhetoric that was a little bit naive about, norms, and, that kind of maybe did us a bit of a disservice in terms of contemplating these possibilities.
I might jump in on there and say that I think the norms and rules that governed, frankly, 2 decades of coin, right? And then however you want to characterize the 1990s, where we were, the hyperpower.
A historical anomaly.
I think counter-value targeting was the norm, right? For if you look at most of 20th century warfare, when it comes to state on state, when it comes to two parties that have vital interests at stake, I think it's unfortunate, but you have to expect that they're going to mobilize their resources to protect their interests, particularly whether you're talking about Russia and Ukraine or China and Taiwan, when you're talking about an interest that these ruling authoritarian regimes perceive as having incredibly high value.
Can I add? So I do think that there's a difference between fast and slow threats, and we have to be careful that if we get hooked on one operation plan in one particular area of the world, and we aim all of our deterrence energies in that one direction, I think we're missing the idea that there is a slow challenge which is equal to the fast challenge, right? An immediate attempt to do something where we need to think about time and space and be able to concentrate firepower in the right area. That's taken up a lot of the time within DoD and the interagency, at least it has been, and we're working on a number of different things. But these, I think we've underestimated the slow threat, which is the global influence piece, and how capable these other red actors have been in producing an illiberal counter order where people are bandwagoning and hedging in a way that suggests that, in fact, our blue bloc is becoming a shrinking block, even as we don't understand these dynamics because we're more inward now. And I think that's going to be relevant for what dominates in the 21st century. And if we're not careful on these slow threats, we're going to see a Pax Americana quickly turn into a Pax Sinica. And it's going to hurt our prosperity, our values, our security in ways that we underestimate because we have too much short-termism and that kind of thinking going on here. So I think we need to get back to grand strategies and recognize the world we're in and understand that we do have a range of different kinds of things that require us as a nation to maybe come together, make hard sacrifices, and just deal with the world as it is because if we're not careful, it's going to slip away from us.
So especially in terms of dealing with the world as it is, for many years in the post-global financial crisis, there was a popular narrative and a perception about China's unstoppable rise and China and Russia collaborating, and people doing projections about when will the Chinese economy surpass the U.S. And of course, over the years, that timeline has slipped further and further to the right. Now, in more recent years, especially post-COVID, there's been a different camp that's talking about post-peak China and China's decline, and so much of the numbers are, as we all know, cooked, and China's kind of the Enron of countries with a bunch of illusory stats that they're lying to themselves as well as most of the international public. So there's a very kind of huge extreme set of dynamics in between there. Where do you think we are in kind of this debate about post-peak China or not peak China?
All right, so then we have to get into economic issues and all the rest.
Absolutely.
All right, so let's acknowledge that the property market, some people, household savings lost trillions of dollars if you're an average Chinese person in terms of your savings there. And then consumption not happening, slow growth rates in income, volatile stock market, political distrust, unemployment, debt to GDP ratio, all of that stuff, right, is not stimulating the average Chinese person to spend. And then you look at FDI, and the securitization of the Chinese economy has driven away much of that. People are diversifying their supply chains. They're trying to gradually get out, where it took them a while to get into the Chinese market. And so those are three of the four main sources of revenue that make the Chinese engine go. And the fourth one is exports, the supply-driven attempt to use Chinese industrial overcapacity to its advantage by dumping essentially goods on the international market, which is creating obviously a pushback in many areas, not least with Europe with the auto sector, but there'll be more of that too. And so the Chinese are in a pinch. Their structural deficiencies that any China analyst has been studying for 20 to 30 years have caught up with them. And look, they've done their stimulus to get the local and provincial debts sort of relieved. They're trying to stabilize the stock market. They're doing what they are doing to try to stabilize there, but they're in a very tough economic position right now. If you think that that's sufficient to sort of write off China, I'm here to tell you that they're a juggernaut in so many other areas. I don't know anybody that would say that on the technology and the innovation side that China is not highly competitive and in many areas ahead of other nations, including the United States, right? You can go into solar, you can go into batteries, you can go into EVs, you can go into steel, you can go into minerals. So you can get lots of different areas where the Chinese are the global leader. One statistic was that they lead in 37 out of 44 global technologies, right? They intend to be tech supreme. That's the ambition. The subsidies, the rebates, everything that they do to stimulate, their tech base has created a highly capable a sector that we would underestimate at our peril. And so the Chinese are investing fully in this because they believe that innovation is a new quality, productive factor. That if they can harness that and lead, that will give them an edge not only domestically with their companies that can outcompete foreign companies, but then they can increasingly grab market share in the world and essentially put international companies under because they've just managed to take the lead or be fast enough. You don't have to invent and be first in the world. Actually take an invention as a fast follower and then scale it faster and put it out there at a lower cost. These are strategies that people have seen over the years, but this is particularly acute in the technology sector. We're doing things about it. Obviously, CHIPS Act is one way. Export controls is another. People kind of boil it down to just semiconductors, but it's cross-cutting across the Chinese tech sector there. So they aim to be a premier in this area. And the fact of the matter is, if you take a look at the way it's working out, where we don't have much penetration on their side, they still manage to actually cohabitate inside the U.S. economy. We still have scientific collaboration. They're in our advanced labs. They're still in the universities. They're in U.S. tech companies. They're in Silicon Valley. They consume all the open source stuff that we create. we are, leeching our tech edge continually, our intellectual capital. They can't get it that way. It's through, IP theft through cyber, rated at $250 to $600 billion a year. So we think we're going to compete by speeding up our innovation car. And we don't understand that the Chinese are in the back seat, so it doesn't matter how fast you go, they're going to always be with you there while they build up their own STEM capabilities. They have double the number of PhD STEMs in China, many of them educated here, than we do. 8 times as many BS engineers. And they have an entire architecture and infrastructure and state support to be champions in each of these technology areas. So stand by, because with civil and military fusion and this level of penetration into the United States, they harvest what we are doing and then add it to what they're doing and more quickly translate it into hard and sharp power.
So, Matt, in terms of Russia context, especially after beginning in 2014, but of course accelerated in 2024, the thought process of, there's going to be horrible economic impacts for Russia due to the consequences of their aggression in Ukraine. Of course, we see, all sorts of leaky energy. The revenues are up. The Russian economy is, larger than it was prior to the war starting. So there's a big, huge question about efficacy and effectiveness. And then, of course, we see the mobilization, as some have characterized it, of the Russian economy kind of to a so-called wartime or pseudo-wartime economy. So how should we think about, Russian strength and dynamics kind of in contrast or in comparison to what Mike talked about for China?
Yeah, I think I would actually interlink, right, some of the discussion about Russia's strengths and dynamics with China, because I think some of what we've seen, and perhaps no small part of Russia's ability to weather, I think, the almost unprecedented sanctions that have been levied against it, in the wake of Putin's war of aggression, has been its ability to tap into these other areas of economic and technological support, right? Whether it's availing itself of sort of a willing partner in China to provide non-lethal support, whether it's relying on states like Iran for UAVs and MRBMs, whether the Koreans are providing actual manpower. So I think it's not just Russia, right? And I think that if anything, you could make an argument, and some have, that starting with the imposition of sanctions, we're kind of following not just the illegal annexation of Crimea, but also the kind of subsequent kind of airliner downing. That in a way, Russia had time to learn to inoculate itself to Western sanctions. And if you look over, let's say, the course of the Russia-Ukraine war to date, specifically, let's say, the past 3 years, a lot of times, we've seen a lot of very hopeful press articles about the collapse of the Russian economy being just around the corner. And certainly it's under strain, right? But, I think, the IMF projected last year that Russia's economy would grow by something like 3%. Likewise, this year, I think they're on track, or at least estimates are, they're on track for slower but still positive growth. So certainly, they've got a tight labor market. They're expected to probably continue to break, post-Soviet highs for defense spending. So this isn't cheap. It isn't easy. But particularly if there's an ability to tap into a sort of parallel global system, as it were, that really undercuts or at least minimizes our ability to kind of effectively use, let's say, sanctions and export controls, other related means to compel behavior. Right? We can punish them. We can extract costs. We can make a very valid case that their act of aggression is leading to significant economic pain and long-lasting economic pain. But not clear if we could go from that to prohibitive.
But we look at two of the regimes, two of the societies, two of the cultures who for decades, if not centuries, have prided themselves on, ability to withstand pain and, be resilient under hardship. So that may not be as fortuitous a strategy as we would think of. So we've talked a lot about kind of each of them in parallel, and Matt, you really alluded to kind of the growing nexus and the growing collaboration between Russia and China. In the last administration, of course, there was very slow attempt to kind of publicly acknowledge some of the material support and so on. Of course, by the end of the last administration, it was, much more publicly acknowledged. How do you guys see this evolving in some of the recognition, both in Asia, in the Indo-Pacific, as well as in Europe, of course, and kind of galvanizing European support and realistic understanding about China, rather than kind of trying to separate the Russia and China, problem for a lot of the NATO members, where previously, whether you talk about Denmark, Germany, or so on, they wanted to try and compartmentalize it, whereas in reality, maybe it should be a little bit more contemplated as a coupled activity.
I might take a first crack at this and actually build on something that you said, Mike, when you're talking about kind of the long game versus kind of paying attention to the acute threats. And I say that thinking back to let's say early 2022, late 2021. You had a very stalwart, very public U.S. campaign to warn the West, warn Ukraine to rob Russia of any sort of operational surprise. And this was a full court press, right? I mean, you had all sorts of senior administration officials, publicly, bilaterally engaging in warning. And yet, up to, let's say, the eve of the invasion, right, you still had a lot of doubt, even amongst our European allies, about whether this was actually going to happen in terms of the large-scale invasion of Ukraine.
Or even kind of wish it away.
Yes. So I think that gets to the need to warn with as sort of far sight picture as we can, right? The proximate warnings oftentimes leave us with insufficient sort of maneuver space, maybe not enough time to try to ramp up campaigns to really convince an adversary that the costs that they would endure for whatever active aggression that they're contemplating would be prohibitive, or at least largely outbalance the gains. So, I think there is something to be said for further exploring this effort to sensitize our partners and our allies of the threat, and use that awareness, hopefully, to encourage them to kind of increase efforts to kind of support what remains as a very powerful and expansive U.S. umbrella, that helps guarantee security.
When I take a look at competitors, we go back to the Dynefel, and I unfortunately have to conclude that in the case of China, that it uses its instruments more robustly and better, and they believe in each of them. I believe we overweight military, economic, and financial instruments. We overuse them, and they have, I think there's a law of diminishing returns in each of those zones. I think we really lost a step. In the Cold War, we understood the power of the diplomatic and the informational arms used in complementary fashion. We've left the Senate, because of domestic politics, left so many ambassadorial seats open. You can't win. In fact, your influence evaporates when you don't have, even the representative from the president can fill the seat, suggest something that country is not deserving in some way. And these are like unforced errors, right? These are own goals. And just represents, you can look at the resource base of the diplomatic arm, foreign service officers, a number of those, what's happening to them today. And you can conclude that we still favor only certain instruments, and the rest can sort of live on life support. On the informational side, the Chinese are brilliant in this, often don't have a great story to tell, and in fact, many things they do are manufactured, and yet their storyline resonates because they're present and they're constantly communicating across all of the global media outlets. I think we need to get back to understanding the full power of the information diplomatic arms. We proved it with the selective disclosure of top secret information regarding Russia's intent to use a false flag to start and justify the Ukrainian war. If every time we use it, and we are using it a little bit more, but every time we do spend our time actually taking what we know and operationalizing it and deploying it for effects, we usually get really good results. And I think the intelligence community is having an identity crisis on this to some extent. The culture suggests that you always protect sources and methods. There are ways you can still protect sources and methods and provide a sanitized extract that can be used informationally on time to make a difference. But I still think this is a slow process within our system. So we're going to have to get better at using the information arm. Jason Brzezinski here in the audience has done some great work on the intelligent age and what it means if you're able to harness all these advanced skills, right? Supercomputing, AI, data acquisition, algorithms, LVC, modeling, simulation, all those things come together to be able to actually use information to potentially create an ability to predict and prescribe and get information dominance, what you should be doing to outfox, outcompete, and outmaneuver an adversary. China understands the power of information to be able to do this. The United States understands information technology as a wealth generator, but it doesn't quite, I think, grasp the idea that it's going to actually need to be on the cutting edge of using all these things to be able to get information superiority and then use it in the right way with its other instruments.
So not to fall into the trap of being the kind of the stereotypical kind of American proponent of military force, but there was one thing in particular you said there, Mike, that jumped out to me, and I say it, in the context, particularly right of the Russia-Ukraine war. Despite all of the myriad non-military threats that we tried to bring there, right, in the information realm, threats of sanctions, diplomatic consequences, reputational consequences, we did very explicitly, very publicly, sort of take the military option off the table, and the rest is history. So I do think that this raises some interesting questions about our ability to deter, particularly against other, let's say, near peer adversaries when they've got a critical interest at stake.
Yeah.
And whether or not our ability to do that, absent some sort of credible military force, would essentially put kind of notional adversaries in a situation where they'll tally the anticipated costs of our threats. And they'll align that with what they think they've got to gain by sort of crossing the bright red line. And if the math works out in their favor, then they'll go ahead and cross that line. And I say that not just because we're sort of exploring that here at MITRE, but because I think that really bears on questions for how we go about trying to deter or compel adversaries going forward.
I agree with that. My point is that you use all instruments and you need to have substantial mill, but if you don't have the amplifier and super amplifiers of diplomatic information to go along with that, then your other instruments of mill, econ, financial, intelligence, law enforcement, they don't have as much throw weight, right? And so you really have to look at how to proportionalize this based on the circumstances. Unfortunately, I just feel like we continue to resort to just a few of the instruments and don't do the whole symphonic effects that you see being played with some of our adversaries. Even with mixed results.
Even before we get to some of the symphonic effects, do you both think there's a lot of opportunity with kind of let's take Belt and Road as an example, with some of the buyer's remorse, and we've seen in recent years kind of the quality of construction, the lack of using local workers, the debt trap diplomacy implications. We've seen everybody from Italy, Argentina recently, multiple places in Africa kind of look at these and say, hey, this last decade, with all these promises from China in particular, really hasn't amounted to much, and in fact has been pretty negative. So there's some opportunities that we should be using to kind of revisit that, and even in a more extreme sense for the global south or the non-aligned countries. Also in the wake of COVID, should we even be thinking of things like COVID reparations from China, given their responsibilities, and some of that potentially linking it to debt forgiveness as part of that, their ultimate responsibility.
Yeah, I think we need to recognize that China has moved well beyond BRI 1.0 and they're 2.0. They're clever, they're adaptive, they take the feedback, and they have gone from largely big infrastructure projects like ports, rails, and airfields, and other things to small and beautiful. That's what they call it, small and beautiful projects, where there's less at stake there. There's a big debate that occurred in China with regard to where they're putting their money, and people thought it should be spent more domestically than internationally. And so the Chinese have sort of ticked off, how do I deal with that? The sort of lesser credit being provided. Today, they don't provide that typically alone. They'll work with the Inter-American Development Bank or others to have the Chinese in there, but have other institutions help them so they're not isolated as the debt collector, which has sort of this ugly face.
The more cloak of legitimacy.
But at the same time, as they embark on the BRI 2.0, if you don't have an alternative to Chinese capital, you're going to take what you can take, right? And if it comes with no strings, and if there's been some greasing of the skids through corruption, which the Chinese use liberally to be able to capture political and business elites, if you have all that together, and you still find that it's a environment where you've been outcompeted there. So the Chinese are becoming more sophisticated with all this, and we have to be as equally adaptive. And if we're not careful, though, the Chinese take a look now at the United States and go, if we let them, right, an isolationist, a protectionist, a unilateralist America will end up sort of tearing up, dismantling elements of the Western U.S.-led international order. All we have to do is weather, stay on course, keep calm, carry on. Let's deal with our domestic issue, but don't get in the way of a big power, the hegemon, that intends to withdraw and retreat from different areas. And frankly, the USAID decision here might leave a vacuum, if we continue on course, might leave a vacuum for China to then fill to a greater degree there, and we'll see loss of global influence, loss of market access, loss of access to natural resources, at
least of friends spun for propaganda, if nothing else.
Right. Friends that aren't as friendly anymore, et cetera. So we have to be very careful of not seeing that a Weiqi board is how the Chinese, the Go board is how the Chinese view their rise into Pax Seneca. Now we are, I think, playing a much smaller game, unfortunately.
So as the last question before I open it up to the audience, we talked a lot about kind of some of the risks. We talked about some of the initiatives. Where do you guys see some cracks in the Sino-Russian partnership and relationship? Of course, you have Xi Jinping and President Putin talking about no limits partnerships, but at the same time, you have Chinese maps renaming different cities and ports in the Far East. You have Russians concerned about Chinese hackers stealing submarine designs out of St. Petersburg. So not everything is as rosy as it seems, maybe at the leadership level. Where do you guys see some cracks that at least might be worth contemplating how to capitalize on?
I think that maybe the first thing I would say on that, Chris, is it's a particularly wicked problem, I think, for us, because rightly so, we are pressing against both of these powers. In one case, right, to hopefully prevent aggression. In another case, to kind of wind down and impose costs as a result of aggression. So you can make a pretty strong argument, and they do, that are necessary responses, right, to these illiberal authoritarian regimes are driving them together, and that there's no responsible way for us to take our foot off the gas in that case. That being said, right, there's a very, very different structural relationship here, which I think we all have to understand, right? This is not some sort of parallel to the Five Eyes or NATO, right? This is not a group of like-minded nations. These are very authoritarian, very suspicious regimes, paranoid by nature, yep. That are really going at this with the enemy of my enemy is perhaps someone I can work with a little bit more than I have in the past. So there are probably some edge areas you could talk about potentially. You could talk about in the information realm, right? I imagine it's probably not the case that Russia is being looked to kind of be cast as the junior partner, right, in this red block, and so you could try to make some plays there. But I think it's going to be a difficult endeavor.
I think that on the micro level, there are plenty of areas where Russia will continue to sort of protect, key industries and technologies, and won't simply open up its coffers to China. It's more dependent on China, clearly, in a variety of different ways. China extended the lifeline, helped enable the Ukraine war, supported the propaganda throughout. So they had pro-Russian neutrality is the way that people describe China's posture there. Look, in the macro, there's a trope that goes around that says you can peel Russia off of China and it'll get back to 2v1, and I just don't think that that's possible with these leaders. Even if you had struck a deal with one administration, the Russians and Chinese know that in a few years that could switch to another more hostile regime. So you can't. There's a high degree of distrust. Relations with China right now, U.S.-China, at the very lowest point, since 1979, right? Can we stabilize, climb out? Graham Allison talked about, maybe striking an agreement where you could say, hey, let's do a new Shanghai communique where you might be able to say on our side that we will never recognize Taiwan as an independent country under any circumstances, and the Chinese have to commit to a peaceful unification there. That's one way to stabilize something. You can stabilize the hostility with Russia and maybe reduce some of the gray zone behaviors by working through the peace agreement and beyond. But I just don't see that it's in the cards that you take two of these leaders that have a very suspicious view about the United States and could ever pull one away from the other. Not while these two leaders are in charge.
So as promised, I'd like to open it up to the audience to a couple of questions. Maybe we'll start over here, please.
Thanks. So Mr. Sollenberger made a comment about the fall of the Assad regime. Russia spent more than a decade helping to prop them up during the Syrian civil war. Now that the Assad regime's gone, where do you see Russian influence in the Middle East?
I think in part we're going to see a Putin regime that is going to scramble to reconstitute some of what it's lost. Right, you had air bases and warm water ports, right, associated with Russia's kind of long-term beneficial relationship, with the Assad regime that really helped serve as waypoints and for Russian entry into other regions, into Africa, enabled a measure of power projection in the near abroad. It's not clear that they have a kind of a natural landing point, as it were, that will be as equally suitable to their needs. There's been some great reporting looking at just kind of commercial satellite imagery on Russia's efforts to relocate some of the equipment and material and troops that it had based in Syria to, let's say, Libya. Perhaps not as an ideal place geographically for them to set up from the Kremlin's point of view, but an option. I think you're gonna see, and this I think will in part hinge on the speed at which there is a settlement this year, if one occurs, and the contours. I think you're going to see them try to resurrect, perhaps, hopefully, not successfully, the level of influence they had. Harkening back to what Mike and I were just talking about, you could toss out the prospects of potentially Iran, but again, that gets back to this overarching maybe characterization of a lot of these relationships as kind of highly transactional, maybe unified against certain U.S.-led interests and norms, but not necessarily keen to trusting one another, enabling, let's say, further Russian inroads.
If I can just add a little bit to that, Matt and I have talked about this with regard to Syrian influence maybe shrinking down to Tartus, warm water port for them, and a critical access in the Levant and the Mediterranean, whether or not they might move into, Libya, take advantage of the situation, try to get a station there, and what this means with the relationship with Iran. And so one could look at a course of action that has a deepening relationship that builds on the sharing of military technology, drones, energy, and then further expands into sort of a deepening alignment. This is loose by its very nature, opportunistic in its character, but that could present a significant block as they do mutual self-reinforcing to make sure that none of them are so weak that the West is able to take advantage of it. China has an interest in bolstering both Russia and Iran, and so just like the sort of the Nicaragua, Venezuela case, right? Those countries have depended and are part of the illiberal world order because they have patrons that can continue to supply them and allow them to stay in power. And I think you're going to find more of that here as the alignments re-stabilize some in the Middle East.
Yeah, it's coming.
Uh-oh, here comes a hard question.
Hi, thank you. By the way, this was fantastic. My question is, and it's all for all three of you, even though it's a Taiwan-related question, which is when we talk about deterrence and deterring China from attempting to retake Taiwan, too often it seems our focus is on, in terms of deterrence, making China fear us, and not enough on making them doubt themselves. Do you have thoughts on how we can better make them doubt themselves, their theory of victory, their capabilities, et cetera?
Yeah, that's a great question. I believe they do doubt themselves, and they're very critical of their own capabilities. The civilian leadership, Xi Jinping, he may be head of the Central Military Commission there, but he looks at the PLA as a sort of different entity that is not yet ready for the kind of high-intensity combat warfare that he wants them to be ready to fight in and to be able to execute in a way that guarantees them a victory. And so long as there's more of a gamble associated with it, we can't trust senior leaders or the PLA ability to handle weather or a fluid dynamic situation, then they're going to continue to sort of do those major exercises intensely, put more scrutiny on the PLA, and continue to bolster the capabilities. Remember, they're live firing and they're using their op tempo, their live fires, their training and practice in wartime areas is more intense than any other country on the planet, right? So they're on a mission to be ready to execute if told to do so. And I think they're more critical of their own military than perhaps others are out there, but they aim to fix it, right? And so that's a concern that exists there. I think that there's a fundamental tension between what Xi Jinping is asking for his leadership and what they might be able to deliver because of the nature of social control, political control. You talk about red and expert, right? You're going to be ideologically loyal. You can always guarantee deference to the senior leader, right? Red. And then there's expert, as in you're highly proficient and know exactly what the right choices might be in any kind of situation in combat, right? Those things are in fundamental tension, right? They're being asked to do both, but it's really hard when you take a look at that kind of society led by sort of Marxist nationalism, where you're going to somehow encourage people to develop initiative in such a way as that they're ready to follow their own decision-making without thinking through what the cost of that may be. The deference angle tends to, reign strongly in their minds, I think, in any kind of situation where it suddenly becomes highly intense, highly unpredictable, complex, and very difficult to make decisions there without consulting higher authority. So look, it's clearly something they're working on, but I think ultimately Xi Jinping is asking them to do two things which are in their core highly divergent, and that's probably the strongest inferiority that China faces. And I'm not sure they're going to recover from that very quickly. My last comment is to say, you don't have to be perfect in that area. You can have a lot, you can compensate, you can be sloppy joint and still be highly lethal, and you can overcome some of these issues with sheer material strength, physical presence, and depth of magazines and proximity to where you may be conducting an operation, right? You don't have to be perfect to win.
Let me build on that there, because I think there's another way to kind of approach that question right, in terms of what we could do to make the PRC or other potential aggressors, right, further doubt their ability to achieve their ends. I think there's an ongoing right now, hopefully a years long awareness of this need for the U.S. right to reinvest in itself and in effect become again the arsenal of democracy, right, or at least the arsenal of this world order that very much aligns with and supports liberal U.S. institutions and is opposed right to the likes of Beijing, Moscow, and such. So when you're looking at these ongoing and I think anticipated probably increasing investments, right, in U.S. defense production, whether it's mainstays of the battlefield like artillery, or whether you're looking at innovators like Admiral and others in the UAV space. I think the greater our ability to rapidly generate and also just indicate that we have vast stockpiles of available material, perhaps the greater our ability to sow doubt in the minds of would-be aggressors that we will be unable or unwilling to enable opposition to whatever sort of nefarious acts they might undertake.
I would add just one thing that the Chinese believe in the supreme importance of People's War and Mao Zedong sort of absorbing the Japanese and then defeating them in detail through a sort of an insurgency-like thing. And I think in the case of Taiwan, sometimes we think about it's red versus blue, like we're going to go in and do hellscape in the Taiwan Straits and it's just China versus the United States. We forget, like, the Taiwan has agency in all of this, right? And it's just not Taiwan's military. They are moving towards a greater focus on what does their People's War look like in Taiwan, to be able to absorb and then be able to use the terrain advantages, the choke points, the ability to employ your civil population, your emergency services, and other capabilities in civil society to make life hell for any landing force that managed to get on Taiwan, even absent a full-fledged U.S. presence there. So Taiwan understands this is existential. And this is something that's very hard for any military. Take a look at our vaunted military in Afghanistan and Iraq and how insurgencies essentially pinned us down and cost us trillions of dollars and many lives. That same kind of thing could be, in fact, China's Taiwan if they're not careful, even in the absence of a U.S. commitment.
Within the context of red and blue or the Chinese, Russian, U.S. Strategic dynamics right now, are there new definitions of what success looks like from the different perspectives, and have the kind of metrics for success changed over the last decade or two?
Strategically, macro geopolitics, or are you talking about one military contingency?
Sort of macro level.
Is this success from the blue optic or the red?
Both. Yeah, the question is both. Kind of what success? How's it being defined, and is a definition emerging?
Maybe let's keep it focused on the red one.
Okay, if I go start on that and then invite Matt. First of all, there's a reason why Xi Jinping is confident. You're like, why isn't he miserable and moping and whatever? It's because he looks at the sort of the grand trajectory of what's happening, and he says that by and large, I like the way that I'm headed. Like, I'm investing in these areas. I am able to convert more of my latent power into real deployable ways and means, and I'm better at using those ways and means. I'll be patient, but I think I can get to my rejuvenation and my dream. And when I look at what's happening in the West, I see the disintegration. I see the self-implosion that may be happening. The Chinese take a look and go, hey, the West is spiritually exhausted. America in particular doesn't have the stomach to carry the world. It doesn't want to be the global leader anymore. If I've got an enemy that the hegemon intends to sort of retreat, then I just need to be patient and look for my advantages. And so their long-term thinking is that things are headed in a really good direction right now, even if the short-term things are very concerning to them. But they're going to wait this out and play the long game And they're going to be very careful about trying to coax us down into a descent that they, foresee is just a natural way of things. And, the issue I often talk about, again, the latent power, that if you only look at the indices of comprehensive national power and you say, hey, my GDP is bigger and they won't catch up anytime soon, if I take a look at my population, my territory, my natural resources, maybe political stability, all those things are latent, advantages in terms of your power. The Chinese say, but I'm a better converter of my latent power into deployable power. Take a look at my manufacturing, my civ mil fusion. Look at my military. Look at all the advantages that we're creating in terms of that. Look at the amount of capital I can throw around to get effects in the global domain. They are converting more of their latent power. And if you have a higher proportion of your inherent power that you're translating into that ready power and you can promptly use it, then essentially you're going to be able to get your way on more things. And that's ultimately the definition of power, get your way. Right? And the Chinese think that ultimately, craftily, they're going to be able to do that on the global scale here, even as they face headwinds economically today.
I might try to answer this in a slightly different way, because I think we, particularly as Americans, we like to define success in a very binary way, right? We won World War I, we won World War II. It's clear, bright lines. Unambiguous winners, unambiguous losers. I think there's a lot to be said for, particularly as we get into a world that is more multipolar or bipolar, characterize it how you will, of the need to really carefully define, I'm going to shift here a little bit to blue and weave in red, carefully define what our core interests are and base success around that, right? So for example, if you look at the Russia-Ukraine war, you could weave a narrative that overemphasizes Russian tactical gains, right, over the past year, and that overemphasizes Ukrainian challenges on the battlefield. You could weave a very different narrative talking about how Ukraine's under-equipped, outmatched forces rolled back the Russian army, rather the Russian armed forces, across something like, according to some open source estimates, almost 80,000 square kilometers in 2022. And this against a behemoth country that, not just in terms of GDP, but your population advantage there was something on the order of 5-1. And you could talk about the myriad other Russian costs and Western gains that came out of this strategic, what I would call misstep on Putin's part. So I think part of this is just the need for us to consider what is truly important for U.S. interests, for Western interests, and how we define them, and then pursue that, and not fall into the trap of believing others' narratives, or of letting outside forces define our goals and our interests.
I know we have a lot more questions.
Thank you all incredibly. So much to absorb. Admiral Studeman, if we could go back to your framing of the fast versus slow, and we underestimate the slow at our own peril. One of the things you referenced was that China is a fast follower. They operate at scale. They send it, and then they'll sell it cheaper and capture market. And then you mentioned chips as some of the counterbalances. Can you speak a little bit to how effective you think some of our industrial policy? I come more from a world of biotechnology and life sciences and health. So who are the troops on the slow side? Do they even know that they're in a competition? The other agencies that are non-military, or the multinational companies that you talked about being arguably equally at risk?
I think there's a growing awareness. I think the profit motive has been so overwhelmingly influential that people have a hard time, not benefiting their shareholders. But now, the prospects of deep loss and blowback are so significant that I would argue that many of our Many multinational companies, many U.S. companies are only maneuvering not because of geopolitical risk, but because of some of the economic conditions within China make it less able or less guaranteed to maybe make the kind of profits that they used to before. And so you find people maneuvering away. I just don't think that America has a very strong sense of what's at stake, and I don't think very many political leaders have been all that proficient in describing this. Look, very few people actually understand or study China in America. We study European history. We blow off Asian history by and large. And so it's no surprise that very few people may appreciate what's happening. But look, a long time ago, people concluded that Asia was going to be the engine of growth in the 21st century. And they're right? And so if that region is important and you have a competitor that intends to extend itself in a way to exert dominant control through a variety of different channels, then, we need to wake up to, what this means, because ultimately it comes home, to roost. So I think that the government, so the intelligentsia gets this, political elites, I think, intellectual elites, they understand the basic framework of what's happening here. Where I think we're missing a beat is that it hasn't been explained to average Americans in such a way as to be compelling. And so they focus on different things. We refuse to call this a new Cold War or a cold struggle or cold rivalry. Whatever you want to talk about it, that isn't the term that anybody's used to date. And so absent this organizing principle, this organizing framework, you can't muster up any support to be able to work together to deal with it, right? And so you got to identify and diagnose your problem well. You have to explain it over and over again. You have to educate people. And frankly, you have to say things that are unpopular. You have to enact policies which are unpopular in order to really serve the long-term and medium and even short-term interests of the United States. This is the missing, piece so far. America's not convinced that this is important enough to mobilize and work together and unite to deal with it. And I think we're going to regret that we didn't come together to recognize the problem.
Joe?
Yeah, we have several questions from the remote audience. I'm going to combine two of them, and they ask for your opinion on the growth of two different new areas of competition, one being space warfare and the other the Arctic. And I wonder if you could, comment on how U.S. policy should change with regard to the threat in both areas. Thank you.
So Russia-China space warfare, Russia-China the Arctic. Easy ones.
Yeah. I think you're already seeing, particularly the current administration, very, very clearly recognizing the immense, right? Let's not underplay this. The immense resources and advantages, associated with, having not just a stake but a predominant position, in the Arctic. And it's very clear that there's interest to kind of energize the ability of the United States to effectively compete in that area. Once you have agreement on that, then I think the rest just gets down to how best to do it, whether you're talking about trying to, restrict the ability of the PRC or of, the Kremlin or their proxies to establish footholds, right, in sort of key areas, whether you're talking about sort of renewed investment, let's say on the U.S. side, in the, frankly, like the icebreakers and other material that you need to be able to have in order to compete there. You need to have presence to compete. So I think there's a recognition there. I think there's probably going to be a kind of a continued move towards it. And then one last alibi, and then I'll toss over to Mike again. I think in the first Trump administration, you saw the establishment of Space Force, right? You saw a recognition, of a need for greater ability on the part of the United States to kind of contend with and compete with threats in that arena, under a more unified and empowered aegis. So again, I think it's another area where it seems like the U.S. is posturing, to ensure that it can effectively compete.
In the Arctic, very clearly, the Russians, the Chinese are moving together and fortifying the passageways, more economical routes, being able to, chart ways to exploit kind of the access that provides. But I think we should look at both poles. I mean, we sometimes obsess on one or the other, and usually the Arctic wins out. But there are subsea, seabed minerals which would be significant to the world economy in the future that are there in great deposits. Those who explore it, those who find out where they are, those who get exploitation blocks, those who have the physical means to be able to operate in extreme cold and frigid water and ice and all of those with the communications capabilities will be first to the trough. And I think this is the issue, is that the Chinese in particular see that and are heavily invested in doing a whole lot of exploration research. Look at the Antarctic stations that they have. And they intend by, I think 2047 is when they rewrite the Antarctic Charter. And they intend to have a big stake in that, to rewrite it. That will give them significant economic advantages, and thus heavy in the south, also heavy in the north. In fact, you've seen a number of different forays up there, including with military, strike groups that we've seen, surface action groups that have been, up there. So we need to do the right thing. You don't want to over-militarize this issue, but you do want to protect your own EEZs, and you want to not have the Arctic Council be diluted with and sent off in a way that weakens it. I think we've had a number of different come-to-Jesus meetings between some of the Arctic powers, not the near-Arctic power that China claims it to be. But we have to have clear vision for why the adversaries of the United States and the West are doing this and what it means for economies in the long haul, right? And so I think that's one way to think about the Arctic. In space, the Russians and the Chinese both have significant capabilities. You can say that today they could have a mutually assured destruction capability, right? The Russians with using a large weapon in space, potentially the Russians as well. And so this is a highly contested, highly pivotal domain. And the Chinese in particular have, billions and billions of dollars focused on being the entity, the country that defines that new frontier, right? They understand this as a form of a global commons, and they understand that the first out there to do significant things, remember, they went ahead and had their lunar probe land on the far side of the moon. They brought back rocks, right? They have their space station, Tiangong. They intend to operate in cislunar. They intend to put people back on the moon and go to Mars. Their ambitions are also significant here, and they intend to be the country that shapes the norms for that frontier. And so we just understand that we need to be there alongside to compete with that kind of expression of power.
Please.
Sorry. We've talked a lot about the countries as sort of blocks, which absolutely makes sense from the strategic perspective, but we've seen with the recruitment in Ukraine, especially in the provinces, that there's a lot of instability, there's a lot of upset. We've seen the same in Uyghur territories and some of the other territories outside the power centers of China. I'm curious, what is your evaluation of the strategic impact of these stabilities? Do they matter at all, or should we be taking advantage of them in some way in terms of advancing either our interests or destabilizing the powers that we're opposing?
So just to be clear, I've got you right on the, let's say, the Ukraine side. You're talking about efforts to destabilize the occupied territories in Ukraine, or you're talking about efforts to sow unrest within, let's say, areas of Russia that have basically sent fodder for the meat grinder? I'm just trying to make sure we're going to dial in what you're looking for there.
Sure. So I'm thinking specifically about the provinces in eastern Russia that have been, really drained to power the Ukrainian war conflict. We've seen some in terms of the Georgian provinces and others where there are there is pushback, is that something that we can take advantage of, or should we be thinking of these as primarily, tactically monolithic groups that we want to influence at a state level rather than trying to subdivide?
I think on our end, right, there's a great challenge just in terms of the respective information environments. For all that Putin's war of aggression is costing Russia dearly, is leading to lives lost, inflation. It's also existing in an information environment that is largely dominated, right, by the Kremlin and its narrative and its talking points. So when I think about trying to sort of notionally reach into remote areas of Russia and effectively promulgate some sort of counter narrative, that seems like a pretty substantial undertaking, and without ruling it out, right? You'd have to ask, okay, what would be the net benefits compared to the cost we might endure for trying to undertake something like that?
Look, I mean, on the China side, trying to sow more discord than already exists because they're oppressed in many areas. We're talking about Uyghurs or Tibetans or Inner Mongolians, as they try to homogenize and make China more Han by diluting the populations. Or, I think, it's a red herring to say that we could end up creating some sort of instability that becomes so distracting, right, that it'll take their eye off the ball somewhere. They're so paranoid, right, that they, and social control is so important to them that they've structured themselves to have enough of their security services to be able to monitor and to be able to respond to anything that actually could be dangerous, from a simple protest, all the way to some plot that may be hatching. So to suggest that we have agency to actually create something at scale by going through sort of disaffected Uyghurs, I think is probably a feckless way to employ our national security energies. It's just not going to yield what you think it's going to yield. In concept, maybe, but not with the level of societal control and the paranoia that China has to be always monitoring. They already assume that our black hand, right, as they call it, is at work.
Everywhere,
trying to support insurgencies left and right. They think we're always around the next corner. And so they already are on a war footing to any of those dangers. So I just don't think that that's the card to play.
So last question for today.
Thank you. Dinas Bunners here at MITRE. My conversation is going to kind of steer back to America's partners and allies. So a lot of great conversation and whatnot, especially with regards to the levers of national power, diplomatic, intelligence, military, economic. Kind of keying in onto kind of a critical block here, going back to blue block. We touched on NATO, we touched on Pacific, we touched on kind of the markets. Turning to Europe, where they still have a big card to play both for China and Russia. I'd love to hear your thoughts with regards to the viewpoints from London, from Brussels, Paris, Berlin, in terms of kind of going forward. So we've talked a lot about what's happened up to this point, but what's the view across the Atlantic with our transatlantic allies and partners with regards to going forward and dealing with China and Russia? Thank you.
My view is that Europe will do what's good for Europe, and I think they're really concerned about trends with all the major power centers here. The superpowers can't be trusted. I think that's probably what Europe's concluding, and so you don't throw everything in behind and trust. If in fact you have a semblance of hostility sort of coming from every corner, what you do is you hunker together and you get your Eurozone, prepared to deal with much more unpredictable, circumstances. How do you protect your own supply chains? How do you withstand, rounds of tariffs, perhaps? What do you need to do for your own export controls? How do you be smart about your investments in China? What kind of controls do you want to put there to protect your technology? How do you look at investments from anyone, right? And so I do think you're going to have a block of powers that, has been awoken to the security realities, but I think that they've awoken to the economic realities of the 21st century too. And they'll do what's good for Europe, and they'll probably be willing to make more hard choices together. At the same time, they're going to play the poles as much as they can. Europe is not walking away from China. They want to set the new terms so they can protect themselves and still deal with China on so many different fronts, because if they don't, their economies will begin to falter in a significant way. So they're trying to manage a very hard situation that they see geopolitically.
I might add to that, and maybe to strike out on a slightly different branch and posit that a lot of key American allies going forward, particularly looking at the events of the past 3 years, are going to be acutely aware of the significant benefits to be derived from being a U.S. treaty ally. Right, they're unambiguous. Again, just look at the Russia-Ukraine war. As the U.S. and like-minded nations have poured tens of billions of dollars worth of lethal aid into war, and despite that, we have seen no direct horizontal escalation against NATO, because it's clearly understood, right, that there is a bright line of U.S.-backed power that it doesn't make sense for adversaries to cross. On the flip side, right, change is always difficult. Europe, for decades, enjoyed the ability to really fund butter over guns, and they did it under the U.S. aegis. I think Mike mentioned, rightly so, sort of some of the changing economic realities of the 21st century. As part of that, it's probably going to entail more collective contributions to collective defense.
All right. On that note, thank you all for joining us this morning here at MITRE for a great conversation with Mike Studeman and Matt Sollenberger. Mike, Matt, thank you very much for all your great insights and remarks, and look forward to seeing many of you at the next one. Thank you.